have an active shooter. We have an active shooter inside the warehouse.
Welcome to Active Shooter, a podcast that covers the whys, the hows, and the aftermath of active shooter and mass casualty events.
They have an active shooter in the building. A second call says they are being attacked.
I've been shot. 1692 means we got shots fired. 4:15 a.m. Route 291. Sounded like an automatic firearm.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
Thank you for listening.
You are listening to Active Shooter, a podcast that may contain adult themes, explicit language, and graphic depictions of violence. Portions of this show may be traumatic for those under 18. Listener discretion is advised.
Breaking news this hour, and at least 8 people have been hit by a van in Toronto in Canada, leaving many of them injured. Witnesses say the driver mounted the curb, hitting pedestrians walking along the sidewalk before driving off. This all happened in the north of the city's business district just before 2 p.m. local time. The driver has now been taken into custody.
While the cases we have covered thus far on Active Shooter, the podcast, have been about active shooter incidents, we've decided to cover a different type of mass casualty event for today's episode. The person that we will cover today used a vehicle as his weapon of choice to plow through a crowded Canadian sidewalk and take the lives of 10 innocent people while injuring 16. While 16 people were physically injured, the amount of people who were mentally and emotionally damaged is unknown, but the number is far, far more than 16. Active Shooter, the podcast, is a High Five Holly production, and I'm your host, JT. If you've listened to our prior episodes, you know that the Active Shooter podcast team has taken the No Notoriety pledge, and we will not be sharing the real name of the shooters that we cover. We will be giving the shooters a pseudonym and refer to them by that name throughout the episode. This will help in clearing up any confusion in the story, while remaining true to our pledge and not naming the shooter by their actual name. In today's episode, we will be referring to the shooter as Jackson. On April 23, 2018, there were many people out enjoying the springtime weather in Toronto, Canada. Between 12:30 and 1 p.m., Jackson stopped at the Ryder Truck Rental Company to pick up the rental van he called and reserved about a month prior. He made the reservation over the phone and used a credit card to pay the $400 deposit required to hold the van. He told the company that he was a local student and that he would be moving soon and needed the van to move some furniture. When Jackson entered the rental facility, the staff couldn't help but notice the awkwardness of the 25-year-old, and that he was constantly looking over his shoulder. Once the paperwork was signed, the woman behind the counter handed Jackson the keys to the Chevrolet Express Rider rental van. The woman watched Jackson as he walked over to the van, got inside, and sat there for about 20 minutes. What she didn't know was that Jackson was making one last post to his Facebook page, stating that the, quote, incel rebellion has begun. Since Jackson had been sitting there for quite some time, the woman walked out to the parking lot and asked if there was anything that she could help him with. He asked if she could teach him how to put the van in park, as he isn't used to newer model vehicles. She did so, and Jackson left, heading towards the intersection of Yonge Street and Finch Avenue. At around 1:22 p.m., Jackson drove the van over a curb and onto the sidewalk of Yonge Street and started forward again.
I was driving down Yonge because I knew it would be a busy area, and then as soon as I saw there were pedestrians, I just decided to go for it.
As Jackson was driving down the sidewalk, he was looking directly into the eyes of the victims as he plowed them over, killing and injuring the innocent people who were out enjoying the day.
Because he was looking at me, and then he saw that old lady, and he turned left a little bit to hit the lady on the sidewalk, and then he started driving down. As soon as he passed my car, he turned around, he looked at me face to face. That's when I saw he was a very angry and scared young guy.
At one point, Jackson drove back onto the road as the sidewalk had gotten too narrow for the van to proceed on. After going a short distance on the road, Jackson hopped back over the curb and continued driving on the sidewalk. The first 911 call came through at 1:25 p.m., and the police quickly responded to the chaos. There were bodies lying everywhere. Uninjured pedestrians were attempting to administer first aid to the wounded, and there were smashed mailboxes, poles, fire hydrants, and bus stop shelters everywhere.
There was 4 bodies on the ground. Police and the ambulance hadn't arrived yet, but people were trying to revive them.
Toronto Services Constable Ken Lamb was responding to the scene when he came upon a damaged van and a man, Jackson, standing outside near the driver's side door. As Constable Lamb approached, he noticed that Jackson was holding something in his hand. Constable Lamb relied on his training and police officer instincts when he unholstered his weapon in preparation to exchange gunfire, as it appeared Jackson was pointing a gun. "Shoot me in the head," demanded Jackson, begging Constable Lamb to shoot him. Listen carefully to this next clip. You can hear Jackson yelling at the constable to kill me and telling him he had a gun in his pocket.
Come on, get down! Kill me! No, get down! Get down! I'm putting my pocket. I don't care, get down! I'm putting my pocket. Get down! Get down and get shot! In the head!
At this point, Constable Lamb noticed that what Jackson had in his hand wasn't a gun at all, and was actually a wallet. Constable Lamb holstered his weapon and began to reason with Jackson, and ultimately asked him to lay on the ground with his hands in the air. Jackson complied to all orders given, and he was put under arrest, with no further incident.
It is a focal point of our training piece. Having said that, that particular situation yesterday, the way in which it went down was nothing short of remarkable.
The scene was chaotic, to say the least. There were bodies everywhere, in the road and on the sidewalks, people running and yelling for help.
Some people were dead silent, and some people were screaming at the top of their lungs. My first thing was, get out of the way, these guys need help, someone call 911.
The van ultimately came to a stop at Points Avenue, 1.4 miles south of where the attack began. Jackson drove on the sidewalk, plowing people over for a little over a half-mile stretch, killing 10 people in all.
The only reason I stopped my attack was because someone's drink got splashed on my windshield, and I was worried that I would crash the van anyways.
9 victims died at the scene, while the 10th died later at the hospital at 8:15 p.m. Another 16 people were injured. All victims were taken to the Sunnybrook Health Services Center. This was a relatively new type of mass casualty event that no one could have seen coming.
From, like I said, for anywhere from the Yonge and Finch area all the way down to the Yonge and Shepherd area, was just, there was debris, there was clothing, there was police units, fire units, ambulance units everywhere.
The attack occurred in a predominantly Iranian part of Toronto. Whether this was planned or not, we don't really know. Most of the victims were women. This seems to be purely coincidental, as it would have been nearly impossible for Jackson to strike only females from behind the wheel. Anne Marie D'Amico was a 30-year-old investment banker who worked for Invesco, which was an investment management firm. Anne Marie was heavily involved in the tennis community and enjoyed volunteering for different tennis events in the area. Dorothy Sewell was 80 years young and was a long-time employee at Sears department store. Dorothy was a dedicated Toronto sports fan and loved the Maple Leafs and Blue Jays. Her family later said that Dorothy never missed a Blue Jays game. Renika Amarasegne was 45 years old and a single mother to a 7-year-old little boy. She was an employee of the Toronto District School Board, where she worked as a nutrition services staff member. Renika was a Sri Lankan native. Eddie Kang was a 45-year-old chef who worked at the Copacabana Brazilian steakhouse. He was passionate about his job as a chef. Eddie was from Toronto. Munir al-Najjar was an 85-year-old grandfather from Jordan. He was visiting Toronto, where one of his children lived. Betty Forsyth was 94 years old. She was known for taking regular walks through the neighborhood where she fed the birds and squirrels. So Hee Chung was a 22-year-old student at the University of Toronto. She was pursuing a Bachelor of Science degree. When not studying, she worked as a sales associate at Holt Renfrew. Holt Renfrew is a high-end department store headquartered in Toronto. Geraldine Brady was an 85-year-old great-grandmother who was known as Jerry to those who loved her. She was a very talented seamstress and sold Avon products for more than 45 years. Andrea Braddon was a 35-year-old woman from Woodbridge, Ontario. Andrea worked as an account executive at a company called Gartner. Ji Hun Kim was a 22-year-old South Korean citizen. She was also a student in Toronto. Toronto, Canada is the capital city of Ontario, and it is also the most populous city in all of Canada, with a population of 2.9 million people. Toronto is one of the most multicultural cities in the world, and is a prominent place for music, movie, and television productions. There are many things to do in Toronto, such as museums, festivals, galleries, and numerous other public events. The Toronto skyline is also well known, and a beautiful sight. The tallest freestanding structure in the Western Hemisphere is located in Canada. It's called the CN Tower. While Toronto is a very populated city, you may be surprised to hear that the crime rate in Toronto is relatively low, and is considered one of the safest major cities in North America. Jackson was born on November 3, 1992, and he lived in Canada for his entire life. His parents were both immigrants, his father from Armenia, and his mother from Iran. He grew up in a normal and loving household, with both of his parents and a brother. From a young age, Jackson appeared to be different. He went to elementary school at 16th Avenue Public School in Richmond Hill, where he is enrolled in special education classes in addition to his normal everyday class. When it came time to go to secondary school, Jackson was enrolled at Thornlea Secondary School in Thornhill. While he was at Thornlea, he was again enrolled into special education classes. His home life appeared to be quite normal. He grew up in a large 2-story home on Elmsley Drive in Richmond Hill. His dad worked as a senior manager of a software development company called Rogers, and his mom worked as an IT service provider. While the family always seemed to be rather private, they never came across as being rude or disrespectful. Jackson's mother struggled with raising him since the day he was born. He often had outlandish tantrums and acted out. Former teachers reported similar behavior of throwing tantrums as well as isolating himself from classmates. If it were up to him, he preferred to be by himself rather than with other students. A former classmate said that when Jackson was 10 years old, he would hoard toys in the corner of the classroom, and if anyone tried to touch him, he would scream and growl at them. While enrolled at Thornlea Secondary School, Jackson was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. He was never seen with a group of friends, always kept to himself, and was constantly rubbing his head and hands. Unfortunately, his classmates saw this as just odd behavior and didn't understand Jackson's diagnosis. He was quickly labeled as the weird kid.
He was odd. He just, most people say hello, you at least say hello, and he wouldn't. He'd just keep going.
At 15 years old, Jackson's parents bought him his first computer. This is when he started playing video games for hours on end, especially a game called Halo, which was a first-person shooter game. He enjoyed playing with an online community and felt that the people he met online